Lecture 8 is about the digestive system, and this is relatively easy actually compared to the nervous system stuff that we did earlier in this unit. And we are actually going to start by labeling the digestive system first. Before we go through the PowerPoint slides. So if you could go to the workbook and find this diagram under Lecture 8, and we will label it together. So first of all, the digestive system is separated into two types of organs. There are organs that belongs to the GI tract, and the GI tract is basically the tube that connects the mouth all the way to the anus, and that's where food is going to be passing through. And along the GI tract, there are going to be several accessory organs. Accessory organs are organs that will add digestive enzymes and digestive fluid to your GI tract so that you will be able to break down your food. The food themselves never actually enters the accessory organs. The food will remain in the digestive tract. Okay, so let's label some of the stuff in the digestive tract. We start with the mouth, or the oral cavity. That is, of course, where you put the food in and you chew and swallow that. And in the mouth, there are 3 pairs of salivary glands, and those are part of the accessory organs. Okay, so there's one pair here, there's another pair, and then there's another pair. These are all on the left side, and of course you will have the same ones on the right side as well. These are called salivary glands, and the salivary glands are going to be secreting saliva, and there are actually some enzymes in the saliva that will help you break down sugar, carbohydrates. So we're going to talk more about that later on in the PowerPoints. After you swallow the food is going to go down the esophagus. So there is your esophagus. It is the tube that connects the mouth to your stomach, and it is located behind the trachea. Okay, so the food is going to be pushed down the esophagus, and you will actually have to go through the diaphragm. So you don't really see the diaphragm here in this diagram, but I'm going to draw it in for you. There is your diaphragm, and there is going to be a hole in the diaphragm that allows the esophagus to go through. So that opening that allows the esophagus to go through is called the esophageal hiatus. Okay, it's basically a gap that allows the esophagus to go into the abdominal cavity, where it is going to become the stomach. So the stomach is right here. I'm just going to do a little bit of the outline for you, so you can see it. It's part of it. It's kind of blocked by the liver over here, so you cannot really see the entire stomach. So I'm gonna perhaps color the liver in first. Okay, so liver is located on the top right quadrant of your abdominal cavity, and liver is going to make something called bile, which is needed for fat digestion. Okay, so this is the liver. It's part of the accessory organs, and behind the liver, part of it anyways, that's where you will find the stomach. Okay, so I'm gonna have the stomach right here. I'm gonna color it over here as well, a little bit overlapping with the liver right there. Okay, and so this is pointing at the stomach. Okay, J is pointing at another structure that's behind the stomach. It's not really showing up too well on my computer screen, but maybe it's a little bit better on your in your workbook. So there is another structure here. I'm just going to draw the outline of that, and that is a nodule structure. It has a lot of these knobs on it, and that is your pancreas. Okay, we will have a better picture of that in the PowerPoint slide. And the pancreas is going to secrete digestive enzymes that would help digest the food further in the small intestine. Okay, so there's the stomach, and after the stomach, the food is going to go into your small intestine. So your small intestine is actually separated into three sections, and the first part of it is, you can't really see it because it's blocked by the large intestine. And again, I'm just gonna draw a small outline here for you so that you can see. So the stomach is gonna go down like this. Okay, and that's the first part of the small intestine, this outline here, and then it's going to become the second part and the third part. So together, they make up your small intestine. So the first part, second part, and the last part right here. Okay, so that's what E is pointing at. E is pointing at your small intestine. So the small intestine has three parts, like I said. The first part, which is this one, is the shortest part. It's about 12 inches long. That is called the duodenum. Duodenum. Okay, and number two is called the jejunum. And finally, we have the ileum. Okay, so that is the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and together they make up the small intestine. So very briefly, the duodenum is where the digestion is going to take place, whereas the jejunum and the ileum, that's where absorption is going to take place. So there is another structure here that is kind of blocked by the liver. You can kind of see a small bit of it here, and I'm just going to draw the rest for you. So this pouch here is called the gallbladder. Okay, so the liver makes the bile, which again is needed for fat digestion, but then the gallbladder is going to store that. Okay, so gallbladder stores the bile that is made by the liver. Moving on, after the small intestine is going to be the large intestine, and the large intestine has several parts to it. We start by this area here called the cecum, and after the cecum we are going to have the colon, and the colon itself is separated into the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon. And the last part of the large intestine is going to be the rectum right here. Okay, so all that stuff that I just mentioned makes up the large intestine. Okay, so I'm gonna add a few labels here for you. A few labels here. The large intestine begins with the cecum. Cecum, okay? And branching off from the cecum is a little appendage here. Okay, and that is your appendix. Okay, so I'm going to label it here, appendix. Okay, so if the appendix becomes inflamed, then you might have appendicitis, and that's a acute situation that requires surgery to remove it. If you don't remove it, then it might burst, and it would cause a much more serious type of infection called peritonitis, and that is something that you could die from. So over here we will I'll call this A, B, C, and D. So A is the ascending colon. B is the transverse colon. Okay, and the transverse colon is kind of blocking the view of the duodenum right here. C is the descending colon. And finally, D is the sigmoid colon. Okay. And the last part here, last part of the large intestine, is going to be the rectum. Okay, and it's gonna come out. The fecal matter is gonna come out in the anus. All right. So just a few more things to add to this diagram. Is already a little bit busy, but I think it's kind of important that we add the following label as well. The food, of course, is supposed to go in one-way direction from the mouth to the anus. Sometimes they do go backwards if we vomit, for example, but for the most part, they're supposed to go forward in a single direction. So there are several sphincters along the way that keep things from moving backwards. Sphincters are kind of like valves, and so we're going to label the 4 sphincters. There is one right here at the top of the stomach. That one is called the cardiac sphincters. So the cardiac sphincter basically keeps the content of the stomach within the stomach. The only time it opens is when the food goes down in the stomach or if you're vomiting. Okay. If you have a loose cardiac sphincter, then the acid in the stomach can actually come up and irritate your esophagus, giving you the heartburn. At the bottom of the stomach, there is an other sphincter right there. That one is called the pyloric sphincter. Pyloric sphincter. And that controls how much of the stomach content will move on to the duodenum, the first part of your small intestine. We don't want to overwhelm the small intestine with a bunch of stuff from the stomach. You must release them in a controlled manner, okay, so you can digest them properly. Over here at the junction of the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine, and the cecum, which is the first part of your large intestine, there is an other sphincter there, and this one is called the ileocecal sphincter. Okay. And finally, over here at the anus, there is the internal and external anal sphincter. Right? So one is under voluntary control, another one is not, and we're gonna talk more about it when we get to the PowerPoint slides. So that's basically the labeling for this diagram. Okay. Now let's do the PowerPoint slides. Let's start with an overview of the digestive system. So the function of the digestive system is pretty self-explanatory. It's where you would ingest the food in the mouth, and then you will break the food down into small molecules so that they could cross the plasma membranes into your cells, where you will be able to use it to produce energy, and you're going to have to absorb these nutrients molecules, and the absorption, as I mentioned during the labeling, occurs in the second and the third part of the small intestine, and whatever you cannot absorb, you are going to have to eliminate them as non-digestible wastes. So the digestive system has a tube that connects the mouth to the anus, and that is called the GI tract, which stands for gastrointestinal tract. It's also sometimes called the alimentary canal. And along the way, there are various accessory organs such as the liver, the pancreas, the salivary glands, the gallbladder. All these accessory organs are going to be secreting various mixture of digestive enzymes into your GI tract to help with the digestion process. Now, the GI tract, the alimentary canal, has 4 layers of tissues to it. The deepest layer, the layer that is in direct contact with the food, is called the mucosa. Okay, so this mucosa is a layer of epithelium that is supported by both connective tissue, which kind of binds things together, as well as smooth muscle. Okay, so the smooth muscle is kind of important to help propel the food forward to some extent, and then there is the inside of the intestinal tract, which is called the lumen. Okay, so the lumen is basically where the food is going to be passing through by. This layer, the mucosa, also contains cells that would secrete digestive enzymes at certain locations, as well as a mucus to keep the food kind of slimy, so they can move forward without causing too much friction. Outside of the mucosa is the submucosa. Right? This is the layer where you will find things like blood vessels, The function of the blood vessels is to, of course, keep the cells of the GI tract alive, to nourish them. And in addition to that, in the small intestine, the blood vessels will also serve as a nutrient absorbing point, so that you can take the nutrients directly into the blood. There are also lymphatic vessels, as well as nerve endings that lies beneath that lies in the submucosa layer, and the submucosa layer is beneath the mucosal layer. It's the second layer, right? There are special lymph nodules that are called Peyer's patches, and they are scattered throughout the submucosa of the small intestine. A lot of the food that we eat is going to contain probably airborne pathogens. Much of it is going to be broken down in the stomach because of the strong acid. But if they do make it through the stomach, in the small intestine, we have an additional surveillance system, right? The Peyer's patch, to make sure that the pathogens are going to be dealt with if they do make it that far. Outside of that is another layer called the muscularis, and the muscularis has two layers of smooth muscle. The inner layer is a circular layer, and so if you think about it, it's like a ring that would expand and contract in this direction, and that kind of creates like a squeezing motion. And then outside of that, there is going to be a longitudinal layer. So if you look at the GI tract like this, the longitudinal layer is going to have fibers that runs parallel to it, and when they contract, they will have these have a motion in this direction, kind of like a slinky, right? If you think about it, moving back and forth, that's what the contraction will do for the longitudinal layer. So the squeezing action combined with this back and forth motion is going to help push the food forward in your GI tract. So for the entire GI tract, you're going to have two layers of muscle, but the stomach has an additional layer called the oblique layer, the oblique muscle. So in addition to squeezing and pushing, the oblique muscle allows some twisting action to occur, and that's a good thing to do in the stomach because you want to mix the content with the stomach acid thoroughly, so you can break them down as much as possible. And the outermost layer of the GI tract is going to be the serosa. Serosa is very, very thin layer of squamous epithelium. Squamous means flat cells, and they're supported by some connective tissue that holds it all together. The serosa also secretes a serous fluid that keeps the outer surface of your GI tract moist, so that the organs in the abdominal cavity is going to be able to slide past each other without creating friction. Okay, you can imagine as the food is passing through the small intestine, there's a lot of motion going on, and there might be different parts of the small intestine rubbing against nearby organs. Right, you remember the diagrams that we label, right? The small intestine is very close to the large intestine, which is in turn very close to the stomach at the top, and perhaps to the pancreas. So when all the things are kind of moving in the gut, you want them to be able to slide past each other without friction, and the serous fluid allows them to do so. This is just a picture that shows you the four layers, right? You can see the mucosa is highly folded up in the inside, and they could expand, right, to accommodate the food. And then outside of that is the submucosa, and then outside of that is going to be the muscularis, and then we have the serosa. So we can see the muscularis over here, right? We have the inner ring that has the circular muscle, so that's the direction of the muscle fibers, and then there is the longitudinal layer that is outside of that, so circular for squeezing and the longitudinal for pushing. Okay, this is an actual transverse sections of your intestinal tract, and you can see that the mucosa and the submucosa here in dark purple and light blue, and then these are going to be the muscle layers around it, and then the serosa, which is they call it the aphantasia here, but for our purpose, it's going to be interchangeable. It's on the outside. So now let's take a look at what happens to food as it goes from the mouth to the stomach. The mouth is where it receives the food, and you are going to begin both physical and chemical digestion of the food. Physical and chemical digestion is kind of like physical change and chemical change that you learn in chemistry. Physical digestion just means you are chopping it into smaller pieces without changing the identity of the food. So, you know, if you put a carrot stick in your mouth and chew it and it becomes smaller chunks of carrots, that's an example of physical digestion. Chemical digestion involves chemically breaking down the macromolecules in the food. So if you're eating the carrot, there might be some starch in it, and then you will be breaking them down into glucose molecule. That would be an example of chemical digestion. So in the mouth, both type of digestion take place, and I'll tell you more about the chemical digestion aspect coming up in the next slide. In the mouth, of course, there is also the tongue, which you know after lecture 7 that there are these rough projections on the tongue, which are called papillae, and that's where the taste buds are going to be. Your mouth has a hard palate at the top. If you push your tongue up, you can feel the hard palate. We already learned about the hard palate in the respiratory system, but in case you forgot, the hard palate is formed by two bones. One is called the maxilla, the other is called the palatine bone. So if I show you in this next slide, we are looking at the hard palate from the bottom up. So this here, these are your top rows of teeth, right? And this here is the maxilla bone. It forms the anterior 2/3 of your hard palate, and then this is going to be the palatine bone, which forms the posterior 1/3 of your hard palate. And then if you go further back, this area, this is where the soft palate is going to be. The soft palate ends in a finger-like projection called the uvula, and you might remember the uvula is responsible for sealing the nasopharynx when you swallow, so the food is not going to end up in your nasal cavity. So you have a lot of teeth. When you were still a toddler or a preschooler, you had 20 baby teeth or deciduous teeth, and about age 6 or so, you start to have the teeth starting to fall out, and eventually they're going to be replaced by adult teeth, and there are a total of 32 adult teeth. So the act of chewing is called mastication, and mastication is part of physical digestion. You're basically chopping up the food into smaller bit size so you can swallow them. Here you can see the hard palate, soft palate at the back, and the uvula that's kind of dangling at the back there. You might also remember the tonsil, right? Those are your palatine tonsils. You also have another tonsil at the base of the tongue called the lingual tonsil. So different teeth have different functions. The incisors are the ones that are for biting. So you have the incisors here at the top, 4 of them, and then 4 at the bottom. Flanking the incisors are the pointy ones. Okay, the canines, those are for tearing food. And then you have the premolar teeth for grinding food, and the molar for crushing and more grinding. You don't really have to memorize what the teeth are for. You just kind of have to think about how you eat certain food, right? If you want to bite an apple, we're going to use the incisors to bite it, right? We're not going to bite an apple using the canine. It's not very effective that way. So the mouth is connected to 3 pairs of salivary glands. We have the parotid salivary glands, which is located next to your ear. That's the one that you can kind of feel when you imagine something sour. So if you think about like sour lemonade right now, you might start salivating, and you can feel it coming out from your parotid salivary gland. This is your tongue here, and below the tongue, you have the sublingual gland. Lingual is tongue. If you speak two tongues, two languages, you are bilingual. So this gland is below the tongue. It's called the sublingual gland. If you curl your tongue backwards and look in the mirror, you can kind of see where these glands are located. And then there is the submandibular gland. Okay, submandibular glands are named after the mandible here, the bone that forms your lower jaw, and that's kind of behind it. So submandibular gland. So collectively, they secrete up to 1.5 liters of saliva every day, and for the most part, we swallow these saliva, so we don't get dehydrated. So what is in the saliva? It's mostly water. Okay, saliva is more than 99% of it is just water, but it also contains a little bit of bicarbonate that actually makes the saliva basic. Okay, we don't want acidic saliva. Okay, acidic saliva is actually going to erode your teeth. You might have heard of people saying if you drink too much red wine, for example, or eat too much citrus stuff, it's gonna erode your enamel in the teeth. That's because the teeth is basically calcium bicarbonate, and it's going to be broken down by acidic things. So saliva is slightly basic, which is going to kind of protect our teeth a little bit. And within that saliva, there's also salivary amylase. Okay, so amylase breaks down amylose. If you recall from the first semester, amylose is basically long chain of glucose, right? So these long chain of glucose molecules. So the amylase is going to chop them up, okay, into individual glucose. Right. So the name of the enzyme will basically tells you what it does. So the chemical digestions of carbohydrates begins in the mouth. Right. So as we go through the PowerPoint slides, I want you to pay attention to where the macromolecules are going to be chemically broken down. So in the mouth, that's where the carbohydrates start to get broken down. Proteins and lipids, they will have to wait until later on in the GI tract. Saliva is also important for moistening your food and preparing it to swallow. Of course, the saliva also has a lysozyme. We learned that in the immune system, and there's a little bit of generic antibodies there to help protect the body. And by constantly bathing the teeth, tongue, and oral mucous membrane, the saliva helps remove the microbe. So don't underestimate the function of saliva. The moistening of the food part is actually quite important for swallowing. You might remember several years ago there is this so-called cinnamon challenge. Okay, where kids, they would put a whole spoon of cinnamon into their mouth and try to swallow it, and that is actually quite difficult and kind of dangerous, because the cinnamon will suck up all the moisture in the mouth, and so it's completely dry. And when it's really dry and you try to swallow that cinnamon, it actually can lead to choking, and that's what happens to this lady's son. He actually died from the cinnamon challenge, and she's trying to end the cinnamon challenge by telling other people about what happened to her son. So there are no more cinnamon challenge nowadays, but then of course there are other dumb things like swallowing Tide Pods and even swallowing boiling water, and of course those are very dangerous as well, and it could definitely kill you. So we must educate our kids, if we have any, about the dangers of all these challenges that are online on TikTok and YouTube and whatnot. So after you swallow, the food is going to go into the pharynx. You might remember the pharynx is the common passageway for food, water, and air. And the pharynx basically connects the mouth to the esophagus. And since it also opens to the trachea, we need to close up the trachea when we swallow things, so that the food is not going to go down the wrong tube. And we know there is something called the epiglottis, which will seal off the trachea and prevent choking from happening. So after we chew our food and kind of roll it into a ball, that unit of food that we're going to be swallowing, that is called the bolus. Okay, so the bolus is going to be pushed to the back of the throat, and it's going to go down into the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that passes from the pharynx through the thoracic cavity and then through the diaphragm. So when we were labeling the diagram earlier, we know that there is the esophageal hiatus, which is an opening in the diaphragm that will allow the esophagus to go from the thoracic cavity into your abdominal cavity, and then it's going to join with the stomach. The food that we eat are kind of abrasive sometimes, hot, cold temperature, and there are various chemicals in it, acidic stuff, spicy stuff, and we want to protect the esophageal lining from these various extremes, and so the esophagus is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified means multiple layers, and these are multiple layers of flat cells, and they are best for resisting extremes, such as the one listed here. Another thing is the esophagus is ordinarily collapsed, is closed, but it will open when it's receiving the bolus. And once the bolus goes into the esophagus, the muscularis, the third layer of the GI tract, is going to create these rhythmical contractions called peristalsis, which would then push the food down the esophagus. And in fact, the peristalsis are wave-like contractions that are responsible for propelling the food throughout the entire GI tract. Lastly, the esophagus, where it connects with the stomach, is going to be there is a sphincter there, and the sphincter is called the esophageal sphincter, or as we labeled earlier, the cardiac sphincter. I kind of like the cardiac sphincter a little bit more than the esophageal sphincter, just because the cardiac sphincters helps you remember if the cardiac sphincters does not close properly, then you are going to have a heartburn. So here is another challenge. There was the ghost pepper challenge again a couple years ago, and you have the person have to eat a ghost pepper and keep it down. And what happened was there was a man who attempted this challenge and ended up burning a hole in his own esophagus because the ghost pepper was very hot, right? So just to give you an idea of how hot it is, there is a scale that people use to measure how spicy these things are. The chemical that makes things spicy is called capsaicin, and depending on how much you have in the pepper, that's going to determine how hot it's gonna be. So jalapeno is right here, and the ghost pepper is so let's see again, the jalapeno is about 4,500, whereas the ghost pepper is all the way up here and it's 1,000,000, so it's almost twice as hot as the jalapeno, and that is hot enough to create a hole in the esophagus. So he ended up according to story, the man ended up having to have a feeding tube connected directly to his stomach for a whole month during the time that the esophagus takes to heal. Next, we have the stomach. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on in the stomach. So first of all, we have the esophagus here, and connecting to the esophagus, the connecting point between the esophagus and the stomach is where the cardiac sphincter is going to be. And then within the stomach, there are these foldings called rugae. They are kind of like wrinkles in a deflated balloons. When you inflate the stomach, when there are food in the stomach, that's when the wrinkles are going to be gone, and it's going to be appearing smooth once again. There's the pyloric sphincter right here that kind of controls how much food goes forward into the duodenum. The food in the stomach can stay there for as little as 1 or 2 hours if you're eating things like oatmeal, and they could stay there for as long as 4 hours if you're eating something that's a little bit more difficult to digest, like a piece of steak. So the pyloric sphincter controls how much of that stuff is going to go forward. We don't want the material to move forwards before it is digested properly. Here you can see the 3 layers of muscularis. We have the extra oblique layer that is inside the circular layer, so it allows some twisting and churning motion that will help mix the content of the stomach. If you zoom in into the stomach lining, you will see that these are the rugae, the bumps, and then there are these depressions that are called the gastric pits. Okay, and at the bottom of the gastric pit is going to be the gastric gland. That's where you are going to secrete a lot of the gastric juices that will fill up the stomach, and there are various cells that are involved in the secretion of these gastric juices. Okay, some of it is called the parietal cells, the other are called the chief cells, and we will look at the function of those on the slides coming up. Here you can see the blood vessels, you can see the lymphatic vessels, and so you will know that this here is the submucosa layer of the stomach. So here is a description of basically what I just told you, and you can read that on your own. There's just one additional thing here. There's something called chyme, and chyme is basically the end product of stomach digestion. So when the food is ready to move on to the next part of the GI tract, to the small intestine, it is basically a soapy mixture of partially digested food, and the pH of that it's going to be quite low, and we call that mixture the chyme. Okay, so basically chyme, it kind of resembles vomit. Okay, when we vomit out the food, you can see that it's partially digested, and there's that acidic taste to it, and that's exactly what chyme is. Okay. So back to the gastric glands. The gastric gland is located at the bottom of the gastric pit, and there are different cells in there. So let's talk about the function of each of them, starting with the mucus cell. Okay, so the stomach acid is hydrochloric acid, and that is very acidic. The pH is about 1.5 to 2, and how come the acid does not digest the stomach itself? And that's because the mucus cell will secrete a very thick mucus layer that will coat the interior of your stomach, so the acid will not be burning the stomach lining. The esophagus does not have the same mucus lining, and so if you vomit a lot, or if you have acid reflux a lot, then the esophagus will get damaged from the acid. A little bit of acid going through the esophagus is okay, because you might remember there are the stratified squamous epithelium, right? So it offers a little bit of protection there. But if this happens consistently, if someone induce vomits all the time, then it's going to burn the esophagus. If you suffer from gastric reflux, then it's going to damage the esophagus for sure. So the chief cells, which is another type of cell that is found in the gastric gland, they secrete pepsinogen. Okay, so pepsinogen is inactive right here, because it ends with ogen, and what happens is, in order to activate pepsinogen, so pepsinogen will become pepsin, the active form, in the presence of hydrochloric acid. Okay, so the hydrochloric acid is produced by the parietal cells. But before that, the function of pepsin is to break down amino acid. Okay, so when you swallow, when you ingest proteins, okay, the proteins are going to be folded up in a ball, right? The tertiary structure, quaternary structures, whatnot, and so the hydrochloric acid that is produced by the parietal cells will help denature the protein. It will help unfold the protein. Okay, so it's going to be in this long chain of amino acid. Then what happens is the hydrochloric acid will also activate the pepsinogen and converting it into pepsin. And pepsin is an enzyme that would chop up the polypeptide. So you would get small chains of amino acids as well as individual amino acids. Okay, so that's what the function of pepsin is. So the parietal cells, like I said, will secrete the hydrochloric acid, and it's going to be quite acidic, from 1.5 to 2 pH. The hydrochloric acid does not actually digest the food themselves, but then it helps with the breakdown of connective tissues in meats, for example. And by activating pepsin, it will help indirectly break down the polypeptide. It also helps unfolds the polypeptide, right, as I said. There is another thing that is produced by the parietal cells. It is called the intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is a sugary protein, glycoprotein, that binds to vitamin B12. Okay, and we need B12 to make red blood cells, and so without vitamin B12, you're going to become anemic. This type of anemia is called pernicious anemia. So the B12 is very sensitive to the acidic environment in the stomach, and so you have to protect it with the intrinsic factor. Okay? So basically, the intrinsic factor will bind to the B12 and shield it from the acidic environment, so that you can absorb it later. So people without intrinsic factors will not be able to protect the B12, which then results in the pernicious anemia. So they will have to take vitamin B12 supplement as injections, so they go directly into the bloodstream. We talk about the mucus cells that produce a thick layer of mucus to protect the stomach, and because of this thick layer, it's impossible to absorb anything in the stomach, and the foods aren't ready to be absorbed anyways. They were not completely broken down. The only thing that could go through the mucus layer is alcohol and water. Okay. When food leaves the stomach, it is going to be a thick soapy liquid called chyme. We mentioned this earlier, and the pyloric sphincter will kind of open and close repeatedly to help squirt the chyme into the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And by this you can regulate how much is going to go forward. Another reason why this is necessary is that the duodenum is not protected by mucus, right? So you cannot overwhelm it with too much acid at a time. It's going to burn it. So just a little bit at a time, so that you will have time to neutralize the acid, and you can neutralize the acid because of a secretion that is coming from the pancreas. I will elaborate on that in the coming up slides. So now that's it for this video. In the next video, we will go through the rest of the digestive system.